What happened to Snackwell's cookies is one of the most revealing stories about how an entire country tried to outsmart its own appetite and lost. In the 1990s, these fat-free cookies were everywhere. They had commercials on TV, prime supermarket shelf space, and a promise baked right in. You could have your chocolate, creme filling, soft little devil's food cakes, and still be good. For a while, those green boxes felt like a cheat code for the American diet. Today, the brand is gone. The boxes are off the shelves. Snackwell's survives mostly as a punchline in nostalgia threads and as a cautionary tale in nutrition talks. This is the story of the cookie that said, "Go ahead, eat the whole box," and what happened when people actually did. To understand Snackwell's, you have to go back to the early 1990s, when fat was public enemy number one. For years, U.S. dietary guidelines and that famous food pyramid had hammered home the same message: cut the fat. Saturated fat was blamed for heart disease. Dietary fat in general was linked, often too simply, to weight gain. Magazine covers shouted about low-fat living. Doctors told patients to watch their cholesterol. Supermarket shelves started to fill up with light, reduced fat, and fat-free versions of everything from salad dressing to ice cream. The logic felt obvious. Fat has more calories per gram than protein or carbohydrates. So if you cut fat, the thinking went the pounds would follow. Food companies saw a giant opportunity. If they could strip most of the fat out of America's favorite snacks and still make them taste decent, they wouldn't just be selling cookies, they'd be selling absolution. Nabisco, one of the biggest names in the cookie aisle, decided it wasn't enough to just tweak existing brands. They needed a whole new line built around the low-fat gospel. Inside Nabisco, the Snackwell's project was literally called Project Zero, as in zero fat. The goal was simple on paper and incredibly complicated in practice. Recreate the experience of eating a chocolate cookie or a creme-filled sandwich without relying on butter, oil, or egg yolks. Food scientists and marketers worked side by side. They knew the product had to hit 3 targets at once. Look like a real cookie, not a diet cracker. Taste indulgent enough that people wouldn't feel punished. Stay within strict fat limits to earn that fat-free or low-fat claim on the label. The solution was familiar to anyone who lived through that era. Pull out the fat and replace the missing texture and flavor with more sugar, more refined flour, and various starches and gums. The result was a soft, cakey texture that felt light in the mouth and even lighter in the stomach. In 1992, Nabisco rolled out the new line. The name captured the whole pitch in a single word: Snackwell's. You weren't just snacking, you were snacking well. The first products set the tone. Devil's Food cookie cakes, soft chocolate domes with a marshmallowy center and a shiny coating proudly labeled fat-free. Vanilla creme sandwich cookies with the familiar sandwich cookie look but a better-for-you label. Shortbread-style cookies, later pretzels, and crackers, all marketed as reduced fat or fat-free alternatives to the bad versions everyone was now supposed to avoid. On paper, it sounded like nutrition science had finally delivered the dream. You could eat cookies and still follow the rules. America was ready, and then some. Snackwell's didn't just sell, it exploded. Almost overnight, those green boxes became fixtures in carts and cupboards. Devil's Food cookies were so popular that stores routinely sold out. Nabisco leaned into it, even printing sold-out signs in Snackwell's green for supermarkets to hang on empty shelves, turning scarcity into free advertising. For a stretch in the mid-90s, Snackwell's cookies were so hot, they rivaled, and in some metrics even edged past, icons like Oreos. For a brand built on the idea of restraint, it inspired anything but. The advertising told you exactly how to feel. Snackwell's commercials played up the absurdity of a chocolate-covered cookie that somehow didn't count as cheating. There was the Cookie Man character, a harried, slightly frazzled Nabisco rep mobbed by desperate shoppers demanding more Snackwells. The taglines and tone all pushed the same message. This stuff is so good, we can't keep it on shelves, and you can feel virtuous eating it anyway. The core psychological trick was simple. Snackwells wasn't sold as a compromise, it was sold as a loophole. That mindset became so pervasive that economists and psychologists later gave it a name: the Snackwell effect. The idea is that when people see a diet or health claim on a product, they don't necessarily eat less. They often give themselves permission to eat more. A cookie that might once have been a 1 or 2 treat suddenly became a license to demolish a sleeve because, hey, it's fat-free. In kitchens and office break rooms across America, that's exactly what happened. People grabbed extra cookies, poured bigger portions into bowls, or kept reaching into the box during late-night TV, reassuring themselves that the lack of fat made it all fine. The packaging promised moderation. The psychology encouraged the opposite. Under the hood, the numbers were less generous than the marketing. To keep the cookies palatable without fat, Snackwell's recipes leaned heavily into sugar and refined starches. On a label, the fat grams looked impressively low. The calorie count, once you added up the carbs and sugar, looked far less saintly. And then there was the fullness problem. Fat is not just a flavor carrier. It also helps you feel satisfied. In pulling most of it out, Nabisco had created a cookie that tasted sweet and chocolatey enough, but didn't stick with you. 1 or 2 didn't feel like enough. 4, 5, 6 still felt weirdly insubstantial. In other words, the exact design choices that made Snackwells look virtuous on paper also made it easier to mindlessly overeat. That is the Snackwell effect in action. A healthy label leading to behavior that completely cancels out the intended benefit. But in the early to mid-90s, calorie math wasn't the story. Fat grams were. And on that front, Snackwells looked like a miracle. For a few years, Snackwells didn't just ride the low-fat trend, it helped define it. The timing was uncanny. The USDA's modern food pyramid debuted in 1992, stacking breads and grains at the base and putting fats and oils at the tiny top. That same year, Snackwells pitched itself as the cookie that obeyed the new rules. Unlike older diet foods, think cottage cheese and watery frozen entrees, Snackwells embraced the flavors people actually craved. These weren't austere, fruit-based, sensible snacks. They were chocolate cookies, creme sandwiches, and little snack cakes that looked like something from the regular cookie aisle. Nabisco's gamble worked. Within a few years, Snackwells was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in sales. The number of low-fat and fat-free products on the market roughly tripled compared to the start of the decade. And Snackwells became shorthand for the whole movement. The cookie you could eat without feeling bad. Competitors piled in, cereal brands, ice cream makers, frozen dinner companies. Everyone had a low-fat variant, but Snackwells still had pride of place, the snack that let you have your decadence and your diet in the same bite. For a moment, it looked like the loophole might hold. Then, the narrative started to crack. By the late 1990s, the shine was fading. The first problem was simple: taste and fatigue. Once the novelty wore off, a lot of people quietly admitted that Snackwell's cookies weren't actually that great. They were passable, serviceable. They scratched an itch. But they didn't hit like a bakery cookie, or even a full-fat supermarket favorite. Some people complained they were dry. Others noticed a cloying sweetness or a weird aftertaste. The very ingredients that helped mimic the texture of fat, starches, gums, extra sugar, also made the cookies feel oddly artificial. At the same time, the science behind the low-fat craze was being questioned. More studies suggested that not all fats were equally harmful, and that carbohydrates, especially refined ones, played a larger role in weight gain and metabolic issues than earlier guidelines had acknowledged. Nutritionists began pointing out that a diet built around fat-free but sugar-heavy processed foods wasn't a solution. It was just a different problem. Snackwells, along with many other low-fat products, started showing up in articles and presentations as examples of how you can technically follow the rules and still end up with a lousy diet. The public mood shifted slowly. People didn't abruptly stop buying low-fat products, but the health halo around them dimmed. Snackwells was no longer a synonym for smart choice. It became a symbol of the era's flawed thinking. Then came the bigger wave that would hit Snackwells right where it hurt: low carb. As the 90s turned into the 2000s, a new villain appeared on America's plate: carbohydrates. The Atkins diet surged into mainstream awareness, followed by South Beach, and later an alphabet soup of low-carb, slow-carb, and high-protein plans. Bread, pasta, and sugary snacks became the new enemies. Fat, once shunned, was cautiously welcomed back, especially in the company of protein. For a cookie built almost entirely on the promise of no fat, this was catastrophic. Snackwells suddenly looked like the exact kind of thing Dieters were told to avoid: highly processed, high in refined carbs, loaded with sugar, and offering very little protein or fiber. The brand that had ridden the low-fat wave now found itself on the wrong side of the next diet war. People who still chased diet trends were now reaching for protein bars, sugar-free candy, and net-carb products. People who didn't care about diets as much anymore were starting to embrace genuinely indulgent treats again: real ice cream, buttery cookies, dark chocolate. Snackwells was stranded in the middle. It wasn't indulgent enough to compete as a straight-up treat, and it no longer fit the definition of healthy in any of the popular frameworks. Sales slumped. Shelf space shrank. The once unmistakable green boxes were increasingly pushed to lower shelves or smaller sections, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. The cultural moment that had made Snackwells inevitable had passed. The brand now had to survive on its own merits, and it was struggling. As Snackwells slipped out of the spotlight, it also slipped down the list of corporate priorities. The brand began under Nabisco, which was folded into larger corporate structures and eventually sat under the Kraft and then Mondelez umbrellas. For a global snack company focused on powerhouses like Oreo, Chips Ahoy, and Ritz, a fading 90s diet brand was no longer a centerpiece. In the early 2000s, Snackwells was moved into a joint venture called Back to Nature Foods, pitched as a better-for-you portfolio. On paper, it made sense: cluster the more health-oriented brands together and try to give them a refreshed identity. Years later, in 2017, B&G Foods bought Back to Nature and Snackwells, bringing the brand into a roster of familiar but somewhat old-school names. It was a classic play: buy a declining brand cheaply, clean up the label, and hope nostalgia and better ingredients could reignite interest. There were attempts to modernize Snackwells. High-fructose corn syrup and artificial colors were removed from some products. The Devil's Food cookie was reformulated again, this time quietly dropping its fat-free claim. Nearly 30 years after Snackwells built an empire on zero fat, the marquee cookie now contained fat like any other snack. The irony was hard to miss. The brand that had once shouted fat-free from every box was now hoping people wouldn't notice that it had abandoned its original selling point. By then, though, the audience had moved on. For people who had grown up on Snackwells, the taste was no longer the same. For younger shoppers, the name carried little emotional weight. Faced with walls of Kraft cookies, protein snacks, gluten-free options, and plant-based novelties, few people were choosing a relic of the 90s diet aisle. In the early 2000s, Snackwells finally ran out of road. The brand was quietly discontinued. There was no big farewell campaign, no last batch nostalgia play. One day the cookies were available, and then they simply weren't. A brief note to consumers acknowledged that after 3 decades, the Snackwells line was being retired and gently nudged fans toward other products in the parent company's portfolio. Online, a few pockets of loyalists noticed. Nostalgia forums and comment threads filled up with people remembering the Devil's Food cookies, debating whether they'd actually liked them, and joking about how many boxes their parents had bought in the name of health. In supermarkets, most shoppers didn't register the disappearance at all. The empty shelf space was quickly filled by something else. There is never a shortage of new products eager to promise that this time, finally, you can snack without consequences. In a way, that quiet exit was fitting. Snackwell's had always been more about the idea of the cookie than the cookie itself. When that idea stopped working, the product lost its reason to exist. Seen from today, Snackwell's looks less like a quirky 90s footnote and more like a textbook case study in how stories about food can overpower the facts. The brand took a few true observations: that people needed to reduce certain fats, that calories from fat were dense, that many diets were heavy on greasy snacks, and spun them into an overly simple promise: fat-free equals guilt-free. Somewhere in translation, everything else dropped out: sugar, portion size, overall diet, actual satisfaction. All of that was pushed off stage. Consumers went along because the story felt so good. You didn't have to become a nutrition expert. You didn't have to cook differently. You didn't have to eat vegetables if you didn't want to. You just had to swap one box of cookies for another and maybe buy a low-fat yogurt on the way out. The Snackwell effect? That pattern of overindulging in light foods because they seem safe became one of the clearest examples of how health claims can backfire. The very label meant to nudge people toward better choices ended up giving them moral license to overdo it. When the science and the fashion shifted, the story fell apart. Once people stopped believing that fat-free meant healthy, Snackwell's had nothing left to stand on except habit and nostalgia. That's not enough to carry a brand through decades of changing tastes. Today, if you walk down the cookie aisle looking for those familiar green boxes, you won't find them. What remains is memory, and for some people, a little bit of embarrassment. The memory of kitchen cabinets full of Snackwells because parents wanted to do the right thing. The memory of demolishing half a box and feeling virtuous because the label said fat-free. The realization years later that those choices were driven more by story than substance. Snackwell's didn't just rise and fall as a 90s snack brand. It rode to glory on a single idea: that you could out-label your way around appetite and biology. For a while, it worked. Then, the narrative changed. The numbers caught up. And the brand that once symbolized smart snacking quietly slipped into history. The low-fat craze moved on. New diet villains took its place. The cookie aisle filled with other promises. And Snackwell's was left as a ghost from that very specific moment in time when a box of fat-free cookies looked like the key to having everything: taste, health, and a completely clear conscience, one more bite at a time. If you enjoyed this look back at one of the 90s most iconic diet disasters, hit that subscribe button and check out our other videos on the rise and fall of America's biggest food brands.